I feel like you've already answered a lot of the questions I had lined up for you. But I'm going to ask you to go deeper into some of them. Okay. And also, I'm going to ask Anjali and Kojo to respond.
Yeah, sure.
I was thinking, in a way, to start with the question of timeliness that I also asked Anjali and Kojo, and you touched on it briefly, but I wonder if you could go more deeply into why you, in a way, quite quickly in the project, zoned in on Amy Ashwood Garvey.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of, that her kind of work does present questions for the now in terms of her as a community organizer, as an activist, and I think it'd be nice to hear more from you about what you, and also in a way a process of research almost opens up questions rather than answers them. So
yeah, okay, so the timeliness. I think we all kind of know where we are, in a way. I think we all know what's happening at the polls, in the elections, in changes to legislation, in explicitly racist and illegal acts like stripping people of citizenship, which that's not on the table for the young boy who's in the news this week, the young British boy, he's aged 18, who says he wants to come back from Syria because he misses Doctor Who and pasties, and no one is calling for his passport to be taken away. So it is a lever that is explicitly being applied in the case of people with comparatively recent diasporic origins, or actually I would say people who are now in the UK, who are British, whose families come from the former colonies. I would prefer to bring that word back into use. So I think there is, what's the expression I'm looking for here? There are always these processes of rediscovery, these processes when people, these processes or moments where people look to history, they look to the past, they remember certain figures, they re-engage with the ideas and the work of certain figures in order to provide either intellectual or in some cases even just emotional sustenance in the contemporary moment, and as part of the process of formulating their contemporary political concerns and assigning them a lineage. And this is something that happens across the political spectrum. I think struggles over narratives for the past are at play more or less in every contemporary argument. This is my observation. And I think that in the case of someone like Amy Ashwood Garvey, there is, as you know, as I said, as we all know where we are, someone like her who was a very defiantly international figure, you know, her not statelessness, I wouldn't say she was stateless, but that her alliances and her allegiances were multiple. Her impact was international, is a figure who's very interesting and useful for people who are working now to think with in terms of trying to conceive of strategies for solidarity, strategies for organizing, ways of and articulating a lineage for these practices. So I think that's something that's definitely going on. I think certainly in the UK, certainly in London, and I learnt this a lot from from working with Nadia is that who wrote her PhD on the history of organizing of women of color in the UK, is that this movement is on the rise again. And this is happening on many levels in terms of fights for housing, fights around strike, fights for around education, around income. The campaign for a living wage, for example, in the UK, which has become a very, the lowest waged, it's gendered and racialized. So this, and also to do with papers. So this is also another movement in which the kinds of work that Amy Ashwood Garvey was doing across the UK, across Europe, and across Africa, and across the Caribbean, and across the US, between leaving Marcus Garvey and dying in 1969, becomes a very useful resource for thinking about strategies. What's also possible to do now with the maturity of certain kinds of Black feminist discourses is to be able to see, understand, and to valorize the kinds of practices that she was engaged in as legitimate political activity. So whereas the kind of normative male mode is very much driven by speeches, pamphlets, talking, but actually running a restaurant and a nightclub can itself be part of the struggle. And this is not only is this because it's a way of making money, this is a huge question that I started to ask myself, is how do you, and this is before charitable foundations and whatever, how do you make a living? How do you eat while you do this work, particularly if you don't have a husband in the 1930s or whatever. So running a restaurant, putting out records, running a nightclub, not only are these spaces where people met to organize, but they also provided really important spaces of repose and spaces for recharging in the course of what we know to have been incredibly drawn out, very, very acrimonious, and in many cases extremely violent political campaigns. So actually, these spaces in and of themselves have an enormous value and a structural impact on the abilities of these struggles to sustain themselves. But this is something, this kind of work becomes devalorized because it becomes feminized. And of course, women's work doesn't mean anything within a certain framework that I hope most people in this room are actively challenging on a daily basis. So I think this is a space where someone like Amy Ashwood Garvey, and the kind of prescience of it really as well, to be doing social work avant la lettre, to be being the social worker, to be fighting around housing, to be helping to organize basic things like accommodation for people in a place where it was often very hard, and even still can be, to find a place to live. So I think finding a way to remember, to create a lineage, and also to draw sustenance on many levels is the way that someone like Amy Ashwood Garvey seems to have it seems to have found its moment. And what was very interesting, actually, is that many of the activists who I've met, young activists I'd met in London through working with Nadia and making this exhibition, had never themselves heard of Amy Ashwood Garvey before the exhibition. So it's giving them something. It was also really, it was a surprise, but it was also really exciting because, as I said, there is a possibility here for this to be taken up out beyond the time and space of the gallery exhibition.
You talked about how you used the space of the exhibition as a kind of repository and a working space. But I wanted to ask you about, in a way, like a broader question about the space of art and what, like a practice like this, like what you can use the space of art for in relation to this kind of work, research, and how you see it as a kind of practice, let's say an art practice.
Oh God. It's all the easy questions, like what's 2 + 2? I'm going through another period at the moment of not quite knowing what I'm doing, and struggling to find words to describe it. I think that's because some of the words I used to use have their currency has shifted. So I think for me, talking about research 5 years ago is something quite different from talking about research now. I also, full disclosure, say this as someone who has accidentally found themselves in a PhD program. I didn't join a PhD program, but it is one now, and it's a PhD in artistic research, which I have a strange relationship with, because on the one hand, I think those 2 words are quite useful words to think with in terms of what I do, but at the same time, the way in which they're perhaps interpreted, or the kind of frame that they produce within the context of this PhD program, isn't one that with which I necessarily identify. I think, a little bit like Irit was saying yesterday, that if I understood her correctly, is that there are possibilities that can open up in the space of contemporary art that are not necessarily possible in other places. I think one of those is to do with temporal engagements, I think in a really basic way. I think people spend time in galleries in a way that they don't really nearly anywhere else. Perhaps the cinema is the other space, but in this world where everything is faster and faster and we're all constantly moving, that being able to go to a place where things are quite slow, and it has a value in relation to the things that I'm interested in sharing, and in the kinds of questions that I'm interested in exploring together with other people. I think that's something which is really valuable about moving into that space. And also that this is something that can have a duration. So not only is there there's also the space and time of one's visit to the exhibition, but there's also the fact the exhibition might be on for quite a long time. So lots of discussions and can evolve, over the course of what in the end for me was 4 months. That I can make this poster and then Marika can tell me, actually this is this, and then I can move things on, is something I find very exciting. I can't remember who the name of the theorist who coined the term scavenger methodology. I can't remember, maybe somebody in the room knows this person. But I think that the kind of post-conceptual contemporary art space allows for this possibility somehow, that you can draw on, incorporate, mimic, a variety of different modes of address, modes of practice that allow things to come together and to be thought together within this framework that would be more difficult to achieve in the context of, say, the Academic Association of Historians conference, or in an article for a newspaper. I think this is also to do, again, a little bit with my questions about setting records straight, because there's a multi-trajectory possibility in terms of the encounter with materials in the space of the exhibition, which is not the same as reading an article from beginning to end, is not the same as you can come in from different angles, exit from different angles, make different connections and not pin something down. And I think that's also something which is really important. The other key thing for me, really, speaking about, I'm trying to avoid so many words, talking about what I do, is that in thinking about history and the historical record or practices of historiography, there is somehow always an image, there is somehow always an exhibition. This is an area of practice which has been of culture practice, which is so influential in terms of producing our ideas and our understanding of the past, to the point where we don't even necessarily recognize it. And I think bringing this responsibility back to the space of the exhibition is something that I feel is very important. I'm thinking, while saying this, of a piece I made a couple of years ago called Von Eingeborenen beschädigt, which in English is Damaged by the Natives, which was for an exhibition at Kunsthaus Dresden that took as its starting point the Colonial Exhibition of 1939 that the Third Reich, it was on at the time that the Second World War began. And the logo of the exhibition was, of the Colonial Exhibition of 1939, was the Ryder Memorial, the Ryder Denkmal, which was made by Adolf Köhler, who was a German sculptor in 1919, for the city of Windhoek in what was then German Southwest Africa, to commemorate the 104 Germans who died in the Herero and Namakwa uprising, and which latterly the German government has finally conceded as an act of genocide. So this memorial was then taken up by the Nazis as the symbol of the wonders and glories of German colonialism. And it's a statue that commemorates and conceals a genocide, and therefore in the moment of its reactivation in Germany in 1939 also then prefigures another act of genocide. And my whole interest in this began because I found a picture of Nazi officers standing and posing proudly in front of a photograph of this memorial. So I'm kind of interested always in trying to find out who which artists were there, which photographers were there, who helped to produce, or whose work was used to produce, legitimate, and solidify certain kinds of ideas about the past. And the Ryder Denkmal, by the way, is still in Windhoek and has only recently been removed from public display. But it's still there because the German settler community is still incredibly powerful in Namibia. So.
I'm going to pass over to Angelica and Kojo to see if you have questions or responses to Emma. You've got a mic there.
Wow. It is interesting because I just would like to expand on this idea of setting the record straight in terms of kind of institutionally, how there is you talk about these, we're talking in our work and in, I'm going to leave the women on aeroplanes bit to Kojo, I just wanted to sort of talk about something else. This question of setting the record straight, this kind of demand on perhaps people of colour to set the record straight for institutions, as opposed to these moments, I would say, in cities like London, where there was no need for quantification or qualification, that people of colour didn't need to quantify their experience and qualify their experience. This sense, I was thinking a lot about how when one is born inside a city like London and one experiences racism for the first time, you realise that you have already experienced the end of the world and you need to build your future. Mm-hmm. You need to bring a history with you, otherwise it's just going to die. So this sense of protecting our refusal to ameliorate the guilt of institutions. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of, how artistic research and practice of people like of our generation, where maybe we have that knowledge, mm-hmm. We know not to do that. And how there is this sense that when the institutions were involved in, when people like Stuart Hall, questioned the authority of and the funding of white institutions and public money, how that already happened quite a while ago now, and we've been able to think, or the potential is to think with institutions in a more critical way, mm-hmm. which at this point isn't about us coming in to set the record straight. Mm-hmm. It is about those institutions asking themselves some hard questions about their amnesia and their desire not to feel the pain of their colonial suffering. The suffering that they have brought and the suffering that they carry by repressing, by always asking others to ameliorate, in a way. So, I'm just thinking about this ability that or our right to slow things down and not qualify or quantify, but our right to actually research within a condition of freedom. Mm-hmm. Yeah, not emancipation.
Yeah,
no,
just
definitely. Yeah.
Just to pick up on that, and to maybe kind of both compare and contrast the two projects. Making the Julius Eastman video, the third part of the third measure, took place within a moment of what Bonaventure calls the rhetoric of rediscovery of Julius Eastman, or what George Lewis calls the uncomfortable project of recovery. So in the last 5 years, we've seen concerts, exhibitions and festivals in, Venice, in London, in Oslo, in Berlin, in New York and in Philadelphia, just in the last even 5 years or so. And all of these festivals or conferences or concerts have a kind of self-congratulatory tone by which they recover Eastman from the darkness of obscurity and forgetfulness and bring him back into the light. And this mode of kind of recovery and rediscovery, in a way, we really wanted to question this, and the way in which the video does that is by trying to open up a perspective and forward-looking, future-invocative notion of what Eastman's project is, so that it's not only a question of contrition and apology, and the institutions who take on that task of restitution or reparation, and to try to open up a different frame. And I think part of Emma's point, which I find really compelling, and part of why Emma's work was so productive, generative, and important, was that point when you said you try to enact moments of disappearance, so that it's not so much filling in or recovering or recuperating or repairing history. It's the reverse. It's focusing the lens upon those moments when history, when acts of disappearance and acts of interruption to history happen, slowing those down so you see how what people have called agnosia, so that you understand how that happens. And part of that is to is to displace the demand for setting the record straight. So you see that demand coming, and you find a way to step aside from that demand rather than to reply. And I think it's critical, because I think what is at stake is an intergenerational practice, because I saw how many different generations of people came from undergrads and younger, teenagers and 20-somethings, up to researchers and people in their 70s and 80s. I saw them coming to the showroom. So this intergenerational interest in the work of Amy Ashwood Garvey really points to the question of what is a generation. And the historian David Scott says we can understand a generation as a community of memory that is bound by crisis, by a relation to crisis. Whether you have directly experienced that crisis or not is not as important as the fact that it's the crisis and your relation to it. And in a way, part of what you did, I think, is bear the crisis of the work of disappearance and interruption. That's why that portrait of Amy Ashwood Garvey in negative is so important, because that image somehow brings that enactment of disappearance. It confronts us with it and asks us what we will do with that. And so in the moment of that confrontation with that portrait, you sense all the violence of disappearance, the work of interruption. It all takes on a portrait, it all takes on a visible form of negation. And that it's such a profound moment. And in a way you feel yourself being generationally hailed by that moment of visible negation, the moment of visible disappearance, you know, how to make disappearance appear. And this is what you did. And it was really a profound experience, I think, for those who took the time to make it across town to Edgware Road. So I wanted to thank you for that, because it was a pleasure to work with you, and it took a while. It was both a long project and very short. But that moment was a profound moment, I think, for many people. And in a way, I've only just been able to find the words to articulate that experience.
Okay. Well, Emma, I'm going to hold you, because we are running over, and I want to see if there's questions from the audience. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question for Emma? One over there.
Hi, thank you so much for this. It's really enriching both conversations. My brother studied Marcus Garvey at university, so I can't wait to go back and tell him about your work. I'm really excited about that. So my question really, Emma, was kind of advice around you kind of re-entering, entering academia, and kind of the questions that you're starting to pull together around how you create a space or work with others in that space, which will potentially be a challenging space. So I'm just interested kind of around your preparation of this context that you're going to enter. Just interested in that, really.
In one sense, I'm always already in it. I already have 2 degrees, and I more or less have organized my post-art school life by always trying to have some kind of academic institutional affiliation, and that's partly about precarity, because I don't make any money whatsoever from my work. It can only exist in an environment of grants and self-subsidy, and also because academic institutions mean you can have libraries, you can get to the library, and this is something that has always been a big part of what I do. So I can't in any way claim outsider status in relation to academia. That's a non-starter. I think, although what I would say is, and I think maybe this is a particular pressure this whole artistic research PhD situation is forcing on me is it's bringing what I do into the academic institution in a different way from other ways in which I've been involved there. And that's the bit that's a bit scary, because there's all sorts of bits of paper and descriptions and policies and the rest of it that surround that. And I think I purposefully avoided ever doing a PhD by practice, because I just didn't ever feel like I wanted to have that sort of conversation about what I do. Although I do write a lot, and I'm really comfortable with that, more or less. So if I take a little bit of a side sweep, maybe, just to answer your question, is to talk very briefly about another roadmap school, which is this art education research project that I've been involved in since 2012 and really heavily involved in for about 5 years now. And I organize, my primary responsibility is to organize a consortium of research projects into art education in 8 African cities. I work and have been working very closely with art educators in Uganda since about 2011. And one of the, this is helping, I suppose, this is really long-winded. This is helping somewhat to allow me to think otherwise about how education or cultural education might work. From one pole, to come back to your brother's friends, the Marcus Garvey Pan-African Institute, who will no longer speak to me, who believe that the university is fundamentally a Eurocentric way of producing and controlling knowledge, and will have nothing to do with it, and are trying to develop alternative forms of high-level education that escape those logics and escape those kinds of economies. That's at one pole. At the other pole, and this is one that I think about a lot, is that apart from the working group in Cairo, where they speak Arabic, we can't, amongst us and the context that we know, we don't know a single indigenous African language with a word that translates to the word art. So whenever people talk about art, visual art, capital A, they use English, French, or Portuguese. And this doesn't mean that historically these peoples, these communities were not creative. It just means that what constituted cultural production and its social and economic and distribution was just different and not captured by a Western post-Renaissance terminology. And I think that an involvement in this project has given me a level of optimism about thinking about what I do and what others might do, or what might be possible, that is not necessarily that doesn't necessarily take sort of to come back to your question of hailing, doesn't heed the call of the Western academy or the Western academic framework, and finds ways to acknowledge and to acknowledge, to valorize, and to draw upon other knowledges and other practices. So I think this is something, even while I sit inside the academy, I try to think with a lot. I found the work of Sarah Motter really useful in this respect. And if you know Sarah Motter, she's now a professor at the University of Newcastle in Australia. She used to be, I think, at Nottingham Trent, and is a specialist in the role of pedagogy in popular movements, particularly in Central and South America. And she did a lot of really interesting experiments in Nottingham in trying to find ways to bring critical pedagogies and the practice of critical pedagogy into the university. And she's someone whose work I think about a lot, as someone who's tried, has already an experience of trying to think, to create spaces for thinking differently from within, if you like.
I'm afraid that we've run out of time. Yeah. There's many more things we could talk about, but they will have to happen informally in the break. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Emma, Anjali, Kojo, Annie for earlier, and for Sonic Acts for inviting us.